Hello everyone, welcome to this video which is titled How to Negotiate Without Negotiating. And here I'm going to be teaching you some advanced negotiation tactics. I am the collaborative negotiator. I have over 10 years of professional negotiation experience, and I also do teach people how to conduct negotiations. So this video and this topic is brand new. I've not taught this to my students yet in any organized way. So this is the first time I've developed this material, and I am trying it all on you for size. So please do listen in, do put down comments, and your views would be most welcome. So when teaching about this topic, there's one of my favorite sayings that I always remind all my students, which is that there is no such thing as non-negotiation time. Now, sure, you can be doing activities that have nothing to do with negotiation at all, eating dinner, pulling up your socks, whatever it may be. Forget about all that. What I mean by non-negotiation time is the minute that you are doing an activity that will require or will lead to some negotiation, then everything you do matters. So, for example, you could be sending an email, organizing the room. You could be preparing briefing material, position papers, analysis, anything like that. You could be sending an email to your specialist, to your lawyers, to your leadership, asking for their views on anything. All of that is what I classify as negotiation time. And the reason why I do that is because the sort of negotiations that I tend to deal with and teach people about are the big, complicated negotiations. They're not ones where you just turn up and haggle over the price of a car. We're talking big, complicated projects here. And so they all require significant elements of preparation, organization, stakeholder management, anything like that. So now what people need to bear in mind is that everything you do influences the negotiation. And a lot of people will think of a negotiation as sitting around the table, or even using video telephone conference, if that's popular these days, and communicating directly with the other side. And that is, of course, active negotiation time, sitting on a table. But actually, there's an awful lot that happens before you ever even have your first meeting. There's also a lot that happens in between meetings, and even quite a bit that happens once the meetings have ended and all the sort of the wash up the conclusion work has to be done before everything is signed and sealed. So everything that happens in between may not be active negotiation time, but can be even more important than actually sitting at the table and negotiating. They can heavily shape your negotiations. So there is an element of you're not negotiating actively, but what you are doing will influence how the negotiations will go. So that's sort of what I mean a little bit by non-negotiation. But to actually negotiate in a non-negotiation sort of context takes a little bit of thinking and planning. So when does this occur? Well, the obvious one and the most common time when this occurs is what's called preconditioning. So prior to actually beginning a negotiation, people might ask you, for example, to make an opening offer. Now that is preconditioning, because that is where you're setting the tone and you're trying to shape expectations. So now that happens a lot. People will quite often turn up to negotiations. Let's say they might have an unrealistic expectation of how much money they can get. So part of the preconditioning approach is that you understand the other side has the unrealistic expectation, and you put in a very low bid, for example, just to give them a little bit of a shock, a little bit of a go, oh, okay, why is that? And then everything you do around that is you explain why they can't get as much money as they think, why they were unrealistic. And you use facts and figures. You try not to use emotional arguments to support your case. So that is, and you can do that well before you turn up to the negotiation. That's part of preconditioning. You can get other people to do that. You can send them information about the product, which will contain all sorts of details in there that will precondition them to know what to expect when you turn up to negotiate. So this is why, for example, for companies, promotional brochures and so on that they send to customers is extremely important. It preconditions the potential customer into thinking about what it is they want and what they should expect. That is a form of negotiation, even just sending that brochure. So it's important to bear that in mind in this context. Another occasion where you might have to go outside of the negotiation is that they've reached an impasse. They simply can't go anywhere. Now, obviously, this is something that happens in very acrimonious, adversarial style negotiations. People will talk about using mediators, third parties, and that sort of thing. So, but that's a sort of an extension of the negotiation. But actually, what you can do is you can try and break the impasse by going outside of the negotiation and influencing the negotiation team by other means. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that in the next slide. But that is why you might have this, is that you can't actually communicate with them, so you will find someone else to communicate with them to break the deadlock. The next reason for why you might use this sort of tactic is that the other side are being unreasonable. They may just simply put forward a position that you consider completely illogical, completely unreasonable, and you cannot shift them off it. So what you need to do is understand the reasons why they have that position, what is driving that, and then find ways to target it. And what you have to remember is sometimes those reasons have nothing to do with the negotiation. They could involve the other side's internal politics or the other side's leadership direction. They've been given a mandate that they cannot exceed. It may be an unreasonable objective or mandate. So there's no point arguing with the negotiation team about it. You need almost to argue with the person who set the mandate, or the people who set the mandate. So you will find a circuitous route by which you will influence those influence makers, decision makers, and get them to change their position and to communicate that to the negotiation team to make their position, to give them more flexibility and thus make their position more reasonable. The other reason why you might use this tactic is that the other side simply refuse to negotiate at all. And they may feel that they hold all the cards, that they have the balance of power, and that therefore what you have to say does not matter. They're not interested, they're not willing to compromise or do anything that benefits you. So this non-negotiation sort of tactic is then designed to force them out of that, to make them realize they don't have that power, or that there's an adverse consequence to them not negotiating with you. So this is to try and force them to the table. And, you can almost argue that's what hostage negotiations are. Terrorists take hold of hostages in order to force a negotiation, to force their demands. So the other term given for this by professional negotiators is hostage taking, funny enough. So you're doing that to force the other side into somewhere. And the final reason, a bit jokingly on my part, is that you're deciding to go Machiavellian. What I mean by that is you could be having negotiations and it could even be going somewhere, but you could decide that you want to strengthen your position, and you could make the analysis that it's very hard for you to strengthen your position directly because you're up against a competent negotiation team, for example, and therefore you're going to influence them indirectly. And so I talked before about influencing decision makers behind the scenes, and you may find an indirect hidden route by which you will do that. So it's a bit underhand. You will do something that makes the other side rethink things. In previous videos, I talked about the way Brexit and propaganda and so on is being used to manipulate the way people think. So this is a subset of that video. So all the tactics I discussed in there, some of the thinking, some of the psychological aspects and the behavioral science aspects in there apply here. You're seeking to apply leverage on the other side, And going up front is too obvious. They will know this is a negotiation and they will counter. Whereas if you can change the goalpost or change their perceptions of circumstances and do that by indirect means, then that is a Machiavellian tactic that you are using to help you obtain more concessions or achieve more of the objective that you're seeking to achieve in your negotiations. So these are the reasons why we might use this sort of tactic. Some of the typical features of this sort of non-negotiation sort of thing, and this is what makes them stand out as a sort of a tactic in its own right. One is that you use third parties. This is quite often used in sort of mediation type thing, but in a political sense, and this is very common in political side of things, they will use third parties to strengthen their hand. So a popular example is the media. You can use the media to put out stories that strengthens your position, weakens the other side's position, for example. And if you know that you're about to enter into negotiations with the other side, you are seeking to find underhand public ways to undermine them, perhaps. So you're using those third parties in that way. Another type of third party you might be using are people with close relationships to the other side that you can more easily communicate with, perhaps, for whatever reason. So you will not negotiate with them, that's the wrong way of putting it, but you will set out your position or your concerns to that third party, confident that they will then communicate that in their own way to the people you're about to negotiate with. So that's one common hallmark of this sort of tactic. The other one is you're going to be targeting something not necessarily directly related to negotiations. So for example, let's think politics for a minute, and let's say two political parties want to negotiate for power. The smaller party thinks that, well, they want to redress the balance of power, don't they? So they need to make the bigger party think they are weaker than they are. So, using the media example as a third party, they might then put out stories that the other parties are in trouble and they desperately need rescuing. Now that might not be true, maybe a completely false story. But what it is a targeted action designed to undermine their negotiating position to strengthen their hand. So that is, and that can have nothing to do with negotiations at all. They could be negotiating power sharing arrangement, but the story could be about corruption, for example, or failures in leadership, or they've got financial trouble. Nothing to do with power sharing in a political sense, but those are peripheral stories that can weaken the other side. And so this is something that perhaps can be used in, let's say, a wage negotiation by unions. Another more down-to-earth example. They could be struggling at all to get anywhere with senior management. Senior management may be refusing to negotiate because they hold the balance of power. Why should they pay their workforce higher wages? So one of the tactics that the unions can use is to completely discredit senior management in the media, report them to the local authorities for investigation and so on. Completely nothing to do with the negotiation, but that completely and quite dangerously undermines the other side. And you can use that as a threat, maybe. I don't encourage that because, apart from the underhand nature of it, making a threat makes it very hard to negotiate. But there are subtle ways of doing it. So, for example, during the non-negotiation or meetings that the union may be having with senior management, they can make references to those sorts of issues and say that they're thinking of triggering investigations or votes or whatever in order to look into the issue further. So the underlying message to senior management will be, make us a better offer or else. So that's a bit more direct. What I'm referring to in this tactic is they actually do it. They've tried to communicate with senior management refused, so actually they just gone and done the action They've actually gone and specifically undermined them by reporting them to the authorities or to the media or whatever. That's a popular tactic by some unions to strengthen wage negotiations. Now, what all these tactics rely on is having a really good understanding of the relative strength and weaknesses. So this is quite commonly referred to as the balance of power. Now, quite often, if you're the one initiating this sort of tactic, you're doing so because you are in a weaker position and you're trying to negotiate or start negotiations with the other side, and you need to strengthen your hand and to weaken theirs. So to make that successful, you have to really understand what are their weaknesses and what are the strengths that you can play towards. And this is why I talk about some of the tactics being peripheral. You may have identified that their weaknesses are nothing you're actually interested in, not relevant to what you want to negotiate. But you might target it anyway because it can undermine them. Perhaps a different way of thinking about it is you can overload the other side. Imagine what it is. You're firefighting all the times. The last thing you want is a sticky negotiation with just another problem. So you might want to conclude negotiations quickly to get that out of the way, and then you can tackle all the other problems. You may not even be aware that the other side is in the shadows creating all these additional problems for you because they have done this strength and weakness analysis and they know you're vulnerable. You will lose time or money or whatever to trying to firefight all those problems. So this is an underhand way of redressing the balance of power, but it only works if the people practicing it really understand, really do some good analysis on relative strength and weaknesses, and they have a strategy on how to target them. And that's the final point. These are targeted actions designed to provoke responses or shocks. So they can be quite nasty. I'm not advocating anything like that, but I'm pointing out that certain people without scruples will use tactics such as this to undermine the other side and to strengthen their hand. It's a popular thing to do for those in political circles even. So, and it doesn't even have to be based on being honest or being truthful, although of course I encourage those at all times. Or it can be that there are actually the other side have done stuff that is reprehensible, and you're going to target that in order to get more of what you want. But of course, it's important that they don't know you have done that. Otherwise, they will either develop counters or they refuse to negotiate and so on and so forth. But I'll talk a little bit more about the pitfalls of this. But what I'm trying to get the message over here is that you've analysed a whole wide spectrum of things and you've identified specific pinch points and vulnerabilities that you're going to target, and you've got a strategy for targeting. That's the message I'm trying to get across here in terms of how this tactic works. So here we come to the caveats. This is not the same as going over people's heads. That's a very different thing, and that also, although that is similar in terms of some of the implications. I'll use an example, Brexit example. During the negotiations, the UK and the EU were at a little bit, many times anyway, were deadlocked on various issues. So one of the things that Boris Johnson tried to do was go over the head of the EU negotiator Barnier, and he tried to set up calls with President Macron and Angela Merkel, President of the EU, and so on and so forth, in order to go over the heads of Barnier. That was a failed tactic. It backfired on him badly. And we saw that in one of the reports where Angela Merkel refused to take his call for the sake of maintaining UK and Germany harmony. So it was an obvious tactic, and it's one I don't encourage people to use. You should never go over the head of the negotiation team except as a last resort and for genuine reasons. And Boris Johnson did not do that. He tried to be underhand. He tried to perhaps apply pressure in a different direction to the negotiations, but because Barnier had done such excellent stakeholder management and all the EU nations were staying coherent and aligned, that tactic did not work at all. So that tactic was carried out based on fatally flawed or perhaps even non-existent strength and weakness analysis. Let's flip this around and let's talk about when the UK threatened to trigger Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol, again in Brexit. And one of the things I think that the EU did, possibly Angela Merkel again, because she's much better than Boris Johnson at negotiating, but the EU brought in the US as a third party. And they advocated their position on the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the US came down on the side of the EU and communicated that very firmly to the US. The US are not at all involved, in the Northern Ireland Protocol negotiation. So here we have an example of the EU successfully using this tactic to influence the Northern Ireland Protocol's negotiations with Lord Frost to their advantage. Classic example there. So bear those two examples in mind when thinking about this sort of tactic. This is also high risk. You're there to create a shock, to provoke a response on the other side. And so there's inevitably going to be a risk of this backfiring on you. If they catch you doing it, obviously that will not go down very well. They can also counter it if they realize you're doing this. This is part of why I talk about being underhand and concealing what it is you're doing, because you don't want to be too obvious about that if you can help it. And they say this is high risk. If they realize, and it might even work anyway, but it might just sour relations. And if you've made the judgment that you don't want a long-term relationship, you just want a short-term outcome as a result of the negotiation, then running this sort of risk is more appealing to you. But you also have to bear in mind that there is a high risk of unintended consequences. Whenever you provoke a shock to the other side, then you can trigger an emotive response. When you trigger an emotive response, things may go the other way to that, what you intended. Or they may just try and get revenge, whichever way. So again, these are the strong caveats about using this sort of non-negotiation type tactic. Now I'm going to finish this video by telling you a personal story, and I never really do this as a rule, but this is a particular example that I thought might be helpful to people. Many years ago, I was a landlord of a property, and I had a very difficult tenant that I was trying to evict. And it was all getting difficult. And then I got a call from the council, who basically tried to put the frighteners on me. So this council lawyer possibly thought I was bad landlord, whatever it is their mind went with this, just wanted to put the frighteners on me and to make my life exceedingly difficult. They weren't willing to negotiate. They were just, you will do this and we will do that, and we're supporting the tenant against you type thing. So that was the sort of the opening scenario that I found myself in. I then looked into what was going on to understand why the scenario, why was my tenant suddenly speaking to the council, what was nothing to do with them sort of thing. At which point I discovered that actually my tenant was going through a mental health crisis. And the reason why she contacted the council wasn't anything to do with me, with the landlord. It was because she needed sheltered accommodation. She needed safe accommodation to protect her during the mental health crisis. And as anyone familiar with this in the UK will know, in these sorts of scenarios, councils try to avoid doing anything as much as possible. This is because they don't have money, they have severe pressures, and so the tactic that many UK councils have adopted is to advise tenants of the law in full and how to exploit it in a way to the maximum detriment of the landlord. So I'm talking that the landlord may have been completely reasonable, may have asked the tenant to leave for good sensible reasons, and the councils will advise those tenants on how not to do that how to force the landlord all the way up to the point of just about taking them to court at great cost and at great stress, in order for the council to avoid discharging their responsibilities, particularly to vulnerable people. And that was the case here. That is what the council did. They did not want to look after this woman, and they were trying to put the frighteners on me and refusing to negotiate. So in this sort of scenario, I have no power. I'm just one lone individual fighting the might of council lawyers. Or do I? Do I have no power? Well, certainly I was extremely concerned. I had a tenant, and forget about the eviction bit, I had a tenant in mental health crisis in an accommodation that was 2 stories high with access to the roof and concrete underneath. Needless to say, that is a very bad place to have a vulnerable person with suicidal thoughts. So rather than negotiating with the council, who completely and utterly refused to engage, I went the other route. I contacted my MP. Now I will talk about various political figures of being incompetent, idiotic, and so on. In this case, I'm going to talk up the benefit of having a really good MP who care about their constituents and doing things in support of their constituents. So all credit, there are many MPs who are hard-working, who are like that, and I'm fortunate that I had one of them. So my MP then contacted the council senior leadership detailing my concerns. And in the letter that I sent to them via my MP, I essentially explained that I had a vulnerable tenant, she was at high risk due to the mental health crisis, and that the council was giving her bad advice to the detriment of her welfare in order to screw me over. Essentially what it came. And saying the matter was becoming urgent, I was becoming increasingly concerned for her welfare, because I really was, and if anything did happen as a consequence of the council advice, I was going to hold the council responsible. Now what you have to bear in mind with that sort of thing, there's 2 aspects to it. One, there's a threat. And while the council may believe they hold the balance of power, they absolutely hate having to go to inquest and being hauled over the coals for allowing someone to die from their negligence, from their actions. And there it is, I set it in writing that what they had done was detrimental to this person's welfare. So that was in writing. What I'd also done was use a credible third party, in this case my MP, to communicate that position to them. And believe me, it sent a shockwave through that council. So that same lawyer suddenly got in contact with me and suddenly wanted to negotiate. And we came to a compromise by which they would find the suitable accommodation for the tenant and relocate her, and I would give them more time to allow them to do that. And I wouldn't initiate court proceedings or anything like that, which I really, really didn't want to do, because it wouldn't have been any good for her whatsoever. So that is a personal example of how I fought a council in what normally would be an unwinnable situation, and redressed the balance of power and forced them to come to the table and to negotiate a more reasonable position. So I did that by using a credible third party. I also did that by making a threat, an indirect threat, that they would be held responsible. It could have involved the press, it could involve the courts, who knows. So that is a personal example. So this is to conclude then this video. Be very careful about using these sorts of tactics. They can be underhand, and you need to really do a lot of analysis, understand how to use them effectively, how to be very targeted, and you should never use them as a first resort. It should be a bit more of a last resort, or if you really, really think you need to do this to strengthen your position. So this tactic is advanced negotiation tactics. It is very situational, based on high judgment and analysis, and not something that many people will talk about. But I hope you found this video interesting and informative on this topic, and I welcome any comments or observations that people would have. If you like this sort of teaching video, then please do indicate via comments or by liking or subscribing to the channel. and I will keep this up.